Today we're going to talk a bit about operators inside PHP, and operators is something we use all the time whenever we do anything inside PHP. Now, essentially a operator is something that helps us with logic, connecting data together, or math, or any sort of thing that has anything to do with operations inside code. And when it comes to operators, we have many different types, and I'm just going to cover the most essential ones that I know we're going to be using for the next many couple of lessons. So we're not going to cover all the operators that exist out there, but we will talk about the ones that you will be using most of the time. Operators is also something we'll have to learn a little bit about in order to actually do our projects in the upcoming videos, since we have to do that one calculator project that I promised, but we can't do it without talking about operators first. So we have to talk about how to do various kinds of operations. The first kind we're going to talk about is something called a string operator, and a string operator is a way for us to connect different strings or just different pieces of data together inside one string, so to speak. So essentially, let's say I have two different variables. I have variable A and I have variable B. And if I want to connect these two together, what we could do is we could create a variable C and say we want to set it equal to hello world. But I already have this data somewhere else. I already have it inside variable A and variable B. So what I could just do instead is I could connect these two together to create one string. So what I could do instead is I could actually go inside variable C, and instead of just rewriting everything again, because we already have the data, so there's no need to rewrite it, right? So what I can do is I can take variable A and I can say I want to connect these two together by writing a punctuation, and then I can include variable B. So in this sort of sense, we can concatenate two pieces of data together by using this punctuation in order to say, well, I have this data and I have this data, and I want to combine them using this punctuation here. I do also want to mention that you should be leaving spaces, so don't do this, but instead do this. And if I were to actually go and echo this out, so if I go below here and say I want to echo out variable C, what I could do is just kind of take a look at how this looks like, because it's not going to look exactly like we think it is. If I refresh it, you can see we get hello world because we concatenated these two together. But we don't have a space in between the words. So how do we create a spacing between two pieces of data? Well, the way we do that is by going in and say, well, okay, so I just concatenated two variables, but what if I want to concatenate a string together with this? So what I could do is I could, for example, say that I have a string and I want to create a space inside this string. And then, of course, we need to concatenate the string with variable B by creating a punctuation. So just like this, we now concatenated a string in between these two variables. So we created a small space here. So yes, this is a way to create spaces between data by just concatenating a empty pair of double quotes. So what we can do is we can go back in, refresh it, and then you can see we get that little bit of spacing there. And this is just kind of like a really neat way to, connect two pieces of data together so we don't have to recreate it again, so we don't have to rewrite hello world inside a new variable. So we just use old data we have already and just combine it in here. And with this, we do also have something called arithmetic operators. So if we were to go in and paste that in and delete what we have already, a arithmetic operator is essentially math. It's just like you learned in elementary school. I think you learned this kind of math. So essentially like plus, minus, multiply, division. We do also have some other things like, we do also have something called modulo and exponentiation. So we do also have some high school things added in here. But what I could do is I go in here and just simply echo out some data. So I could say 1 plus 2. And we're going to echo this out. Now, this is actually just a arithmetic operator when we add two numbers together like we just did here. So in this case here, of course, if we were to save this and go inside my browser, you can see we're gonna get 3 because 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. And in the same sense, we can do with all sorts of operators. So we can also go in and we can, minus, we can also go in and multiply. We can also go in and divide if we want to do that. But we do also have this called modulo, which is essentially when we go in and we want to have the remainder of something specific. So in this case here, let's actually go ahead and take 10 and say we want to divide by 3, or not divide, modulo by 3. Essentially what you're doing here is you're dividing 3 into 10. And when you can't do it any further, then you need to see how many numbers are left over. in the end. 3, 6, 9, and then we can't do any more, right? But we got to 9, which means in order to get to 10, we have one more left. So this would actually equal 1 if we were to go back inside the browser and refresh it. So as you can see, we get 1. And then we of course do also have to the power of, which is basically going in and writing two multiplication symbols. So if we take 10 to the power of 3, if we were to go back inside and refresh the browser, you can see we get 1,000 because 10 to the power of 3 is 1,000. So we can do, basic math calculations here. But we do also have something called precedence, which is something that goes in and helps us a little bit when it comes to doing a little bit more complicated math. Because let's take an example here. I do actually have an example on the side here. In this example here, you would normally, if you know math from back in, back in the days when you learned math in school, you would know that in this case, multiply always comes before plus and minus, which means that we have to say 4 times 2, which is 8, plus 1, which is 9. So if we were to go ahead and do this, go back inside my browser, refresh it, you can see we get 9. However, if I want to change the precedence of what gets calculated first inside a arithmetic operator or just a basic mathematic equation, I can use parentheses in order to do so. So if we were to go in here and say, you know what, I want plus to go first. So in this case here, I write parentheses around 1 plus 2, which means that these two are going to get calculated together first before anything outside the parentheses gets calculated afterwards. So 1 plus 2 is 3, and then 3 plus 4 is 12. It took way too long for me to calculate. But this should end up being 12. So if we go back inside the browser and refresh it, you can see we get 12. So we do also have something called operator precedence. Whenever we use parentheses, we can do calculations, and we can use more than one parentheses. So if we were to do 4 minus 2, then I can also use parentheses around here. And then of course, once we calculate these two together, we're then afterwards going to calculate these two together, and then we're going to multiply at the end there. So again, you can use as many as you want. With that said, we do also have something called assignment operators. And what we can do here is basically assign things to something else, which means that if we were to go in and say variable a is equal to 2. So in this case here, I just assigned 2 to variable a. And it is important to note here that we do not say equal to 2, because there's a small difference between saying that it's equal to something or that we assign something to something. It's not really that important to know, but I just thought I'd mention that it's not equal to, it's that it gets assigned to, because variable a is a space in the memory. So if you assign a piece of data to that space in memory, then it's not the same as saying that it's equal to. Basically, we just assign data to variable a. That's what you need to know here. With that said, this is how we can assign a piece of data to a variable, which we have done plenty of times up until now. But let's say I want to do something a little bit different. Let's say I do also want to say variable a is going to be equal to itself plus something else. What you could do is you could go in and say variable a plus 4. And this would actually work out. This is variable a, which is 2, plus 4, and then it gets assigned back to variable a, which means that now variable a is going to be equal to 6, right? However, this is extra code, and this is just not how we want to do things. We're essentially double writing variable a, which is not really considered best practice. So what we can do instead is we can just go ahead and delete and do something like this. So we can say plus equal to 4. So whenever we use any sort of arithmetic operator, which we talked about, which is plus, minus, multiply, divide, because we could also do divide if we wanted to do that. But whenever we do something like this, we're essentially saying, go ahead and take variable a and set it equal to itself plus whatever is after the equal sign. So in this case, we would also still get 6. So if we were to go ahead and echo this out, so we're going to echo out variable a. Then you can see we get 6 inside the browser. And the same way, like I said, we can do with any sort of operators that we learned about previously, like minutes ago. So I could go in and say multiply. So in this case here, it's 4 times 2. So we're to go back in, you can see that we get 8. But now let's talk about the next operator type, which is something called a comparison operator. And this is something that you will be using very often whenever it comes to any sort of conditions inside your code. We have talked a bit about conditions in the past. When you have a if statement that says if this code is true, then run whatever code is inside this, like the curly brackets below. So to give an example here, let's go and delete what we have here, and let's go ahead and create a if statement. We haven't really talked about if statements in depth. We will get to do that, I believe, in the next video, but let's just go and create an if statement. Essentially, when you have an if statement like this with the if keyword, whatever is inside the parentheses has to be true in order for the code inside the curly brackets to run. But let's go and create a couple of variables here just to talk a bit about a comparison operator. So let's say we have variable A, and variable A has a piece of data assigned to it, which is 2. And I can also go ahead and say we have something called a variable B, which is going to have something like 4 assigned to it. Now what I can do is I can go inside my parentheses here and I can say, is variable A equal to variable B? What you'll notice is that I'm actually using 2 equal signs here, so I'm not using 1 because this means that we're assigning something to variable A. So A is going to be equal or be assigned variable B. And that's not the same thing as doing 2 equal signs. When you do it like this, you're basically checking if 2 pieces of data are the same, and we're not really checking for data types here. We're just checking if they're the same. What I mean by that is if I were to actually, let's go ahead and output something. So let's say if this is true, then echo out this statement is true, just to echo something out inside the browser. So if we were to do this and go back inside Firefox here, refresh it, you can see we get nothing so far. And that's because, of course, these are not equal to each other. 2 is not equal to 4. But let's say I went down and changed this to 2 and went back inside my browser. Now they're going to be equal to each other, right? Because 2 is equal to 2. However, if I go back in here and say, what if variable B is not a number, but let's say this is a string, like it's still 2, but now turned into a string. So is this going to be equal to each other? What is your guess? Because we're going to go in and find out now. It is still going to be true. And that is because we're not checking for data types in this case here. However, if I go back down to the equal signs and write a third equal sign, now we're checking for if they're true and if they're the same data type. So we're checking for 2 things now. So if we go back inside the browser, refresh it here, you can now see, oh, it's not outputting anything. And that's because it's not true, because this right here is a string data type. Again, we can go and remove this just to test this. Go back inside the browser, and now it is going to be true. So 2 equal signs means that we're comparing 2 pieces of data, and 3 means that we're comparing 2 pieces of data, but also if they're the same data type. With that said, let's go ahead and go back to the first one. So 2 equal signs means we're just checking if they're equal to each other, right? What I can also do is I can replace one of the equal signs, or the first equal sign, I should say, with a exclamation mark. If I do this, then I'm checking if they're not true. So right now, because 2 is equal to 2, this condition down here is actually going to turn out false. So if we were to save this, go back inside the browser, you can see that we're not going to get anything. But if I were to go back inside my code and make this 4 again, then they're not equal to each other, which means that this condition is going to be true. So if we were to go back in, refresh it, you can now see that we're going to get this statement is true. And with that, we do of course also have 3 equal signs. We replace the first one with a exclamation mark. So this is going to check if they're not the same data type or if they're not the same number. And we can also do other things than just comparing if they're equal to each other. We can also go in and say, what if one should be lesser than the other numbers? So right now we're checking is A lesser than B, which in this case is going to be true. So if we were to go back in, you can see that we actually output this statement is true. But if we were to change this one to a 5, so we have, is 5 lesser than 4, this is going to be false. So if we were to go back in, you can see we don't output anything. And just like you learned in school, we can also check for other things. So not just lesser than, but also greater than, or we can also check for lesser than and equal to the other piece of data. So in this case here, if 4 is equal to 4, then this is going to be true, right? Because it's lesser than or equal to B. So if we were to go back in, refresh it, you can see we get an output. And just to show one last thing, there is also another way of writing this right here. So it's not equal to each other. We can also write like this, which does the exact same thing. We're just checking if they're not equal to each other, and we're not really caring about data type. In most cases, just to mention it, I do this one. It's just a way that I think is easier for me to make it make sense. So this is the one that I use. And with these, this is a perfect time to talk a bit about something called logical operators, because logical operators, whenever we go inside a if statement like this one down here, let's say right now I'm checking is A equal to B, which in this case is going to be true because 4 is equal to 4. So if we were to go back in and actually refresh, you can see that we get this statement is true. Now, let's say I want to check for more than just one condition. What you could do is you could copy paste a condition and put it inside another condition. And now all of a sudden we start doing something called nesting. Nesting is something that most people frown upon because it starts creating very messy code. I personally have done it in the past and I regret doing it because it looks extremely messy. But essentially you want to try and avoid having as many conditions inside other conditions as you can. Like in some cases you can't avoid it, but of course, if you can, then you should try not to. And one way we can do that is by going inside the original condition here and say, okay, so what if I want to check for something else as well? Let's say I have another pair of variables, and this one is going to be C, and this one is going to be D. And this one is going to be 2, and this one is going to be 6. What I can do is I can go inside my condition here and say I want to check if this condition is true. So is A equal to B, which right now is true, right? So we output something inside the browser. But I also want to check is C equal to D. So what I can do is I can write and is variable C equal to variable D. So right now we're checking for two different things. So the first condition has to be true, but also because we wrote and, the second condition also has to be true. So both of these have to be true whenever you use and. So if we were to go ahead and do this, go back inside the browser, refresh it, you can see, oh, we don't get any sort of output because one of them is not true. But let's say instead I don't want to check if they're both true, but I instead just want to check that one of them is true. What I can do instead is I can write something called or. So if I write or, we're basically saying this has to be true or this has to be true. And if one of them is true, then output something inside the browser. So in this sort of way, you can use logical operators in order to, perform multiple conditions or multiple pieces of logic inside the same condition. And it is possible to chain as many of these behind each other as you want. So you can also go ahead and say we want to check for a and then we can check is variable A equal to variable C, then we can also do that, and we can chain as many of these behind each other as we want. I do want to mention something here though, which is something you will see in most cases when it comes to people doing programming, which is that people don't really write or and, because we do have another way of writing these, and even though this may not make sense to a lot of people why we choose to do this instead, that's just kind of like how people do it. Instead of writing or, what you can instead do is write two pipe symbols. And this means the exact same thing as writing or. And instead of writing and, we can use two ampersand symbols. And these two mean the exact same thing as or and. Now, the pipe symbol one is the reason why I think this is going to be a little bit annoying for most people, because the pipe symbol is not really the easiest thing to figure out where it is on your keyboard. I'm using a Nordic keyboard, which means my layout is going to be different for Americans or other people around the world. But this is called a pipe symbol. So pipe as in P-I-P-E. Pipe is right here. So my best suggestion is to Google this to figure out where it is on your keyboard layout if you want to figure out where it is. In my case, I have to hold down Alt and then the button right behind my backspace button. And that is going to create my pipe symbol. But now let's talk about something here, because right now I just chained 3 of these together, but how exactly do operator precedence function when it comes to this? Just like when we talked about the parentheses around, when we were doing math, we could determine what was going to be happening first. But in this case here, what is happening first? Are we going to be running these two first because we're checking that one of these has to be true, or are we running these two first and then running the other one? Like, what exactly is going on here when we use a ampersand or a pipe symbol? If I were to save this, go back inside my browser, you'll notice that we get this statement is true, which means that right now, if I were to go ahead and check this statement is true, but none of these are going to be true, which means that we're going to take the pipe symbol, and this is where the divider is. So essentially we're splitting apart these condition checks, and we're saying, okay, so these over here has to be compared first, which means that both of these have to be true, but in this case none of them are, so this is going to fail, right? But then we do also have a pipe symbol that says, well, okay, so even if this fails, we still also have this other side to check for. And if this one is true, then we're still going to print something out inside the browser. So in this case here, as you can see, we printed out this statement is true because the pipe symbol is going to be the divider that checks for these different conditions here. So the pipe symbol is going to be the last determiner of what exactly is true inside this condition check here. But now we do also have one last one that I want to talk about, which is called incrementing and decrementing operators. And these are essentially a way for us to do something inside loops most of the time. We can use them outside loops if we want to. I can actually demonstrate this. So if I were to go ahead and say variable a is going to be equal to 1. If I then go below here, I can also echo out variable a, just so we can see exactly what this looks like inside the browser. And then you can see we get 1 because variable a is equal to 1. However, we do have something called a incrementer, which means that I can go ahead and say variable a and add a plus plus in front of it, which means that we're adding 1 to variable a, which means that if we were to go inside the browser, we now get 2. So a incrementer is basically just a way for us to add 1 to a piece of data. And I can also go ahead and do a minus minus. And in this case, we're going to subtract 1. So we're going to go back inside the browser. You can see that we're going to get 0. However, we do also have something called variable a plus plus, which is a little bit different because basically the order of when we add 1 to this variable here is going to be changed. So in this case here, where we had plus plus, we say that we add 1 to variable a and then we echo it out. Whereas if we were to go ahead and do plus plus after variable a, we want to say that we want to echo out variable a and then we want to add 1 to it. So we're going to do this. What do you think we're going to get inside the browser? We're going to get 1. So even though inside our code, this is going to be 2, we don't actually echo out 2 because we're adding 1 to it after we output it inside the browser. So we were to go below here and actually say echo and say I want to echo variable a one more time, then the second echo is actually going to be 2. And the same thing goes for minus minus, of course. We can also say minus minus, and then we're going to output a, which is going to be equal to 1, and then we're going to subtract 1 to it, which means that the second time we echo it out, it is going to be 0. So we're going to go back inside the browser and do this. You can see we get 1 and 0. And why does this matter, you might be asking? Well, in some cases, when we start talking about loops inside programming, and loops is something that we will get to talk about a little bit in the future, but essentially, a loop is a way for us to output the same code multiple times inside the browser, as long as a certain condition is still true. So let's say I want to loop out something until a certain number is lesser than 10. Then we're going to add 1 to the number that we're checking for every single loop. And then when we get to 10, then it's going to stop looping because now the number is not lesser than 10 anymore. Again, this may be a little bit confusing because we haven't talked about loops yet, so don't worry too much about it if you don't quite understand what I'm talking about here. I just want you to know that we have something called plus plus and minus minus. So if you want to add a number or subtract a number, you can do it by writing plus plus or minus minus. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this lesson here. We will get to talk a bit about conditions in the next video, which is something we have touched upon in this video here and in some of the previous ones with the if statement. You go in, you check for a condition, and then you output something if that condition is true. But there's a little bit more when it comes to conditions. So we'll get to talk about that in the next video. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.